Today's presentation is on section 14, and the main focus is on market failure. Now, market failure occurs when the price mechanism fails to account for all the different costs and benefits that would be necessary to provide and consume a good. Markets sometimes will be inefficient due to producers, externalities, environmental concerns, or a lack of public goods. One example of market failure is when there are negative externalities. An externality exists when a third party is impacted by the market where they do not participate in the market. A great example of a negative externality would be pollution. In the graph that you see, the market would produce at price 1 and Q1. Because of the negative externality, the amount of production exceeds what would be socially efficient. So the difference between the private marginal cost and the social marginal cost curves would represent the size of the externality. Because negative externalities produce too many goods, there are three ways in which we are able to try to solve negative externalities. One would be with a tax, two would be through regulation, and three, we could actually fine the externality. The tax that would solve this problem is known as the Pigovian tax. The Pigovian tax would try to eliminate the amount of goods being produced. So therefore, the Pigovian tax would move from Q1 to Q2. If you remember, a tax will lower economic activity. It will place a wedge in the market. It will create a higher price for consumers, P2, and the seller would receive less revenue with P0. Taxes, regulations, and fines are all public policy or public solutions. You should realize what we mean by the Coase theorem. The Coase theorem essentially would represent a private solution. And the Coase theorem states that when there is a conflict of property rights, the involved parties can bargain or negotiate, again privately, and they would get a more beneficial result from those negotiations. A second type of externality is referred to as a positive externality. As we could see on the graph, Q1 would represent what the market would bring about, and Q2 would represent what would be, again, socially efficient. When we have a positive externality, the market is not producing at the socially efficient level. Therefore, in order to produce more goods, this market must be subsidized. A great example of a positive externality would be public education. If every single individual would need to pay for their education, the number of educated individuals in our society would be much lower. Due to the fact that we feel that more education is better for our society, we have public education, and that public education system is therefore subsidized. One of the major things that you would need to learn from this section are four different types of goods. These goods are determined by two different characteristics. One characteristic is going to ask you if the good is rival in consumption, and secondly, is the good excludable in consumption? As you could see at the bottom of the slide, a good is excludable if people can be prevented from using it. A good is rival in consumption if one person's use of the good diminishes other people's use of it. Let's look at the four types of goods individually. First of all, private goods. And private goods would represent pretty much most of the goods that you and I consume. A private good is both rival and excludable. Therefore, if the good is both rival and excludable, it is considered to be a private good. That is why most private goods will have a cost attached to it or a price attached to it. On the other end of the spectrum, we look at public goods. Public goods are neither rival nor excludable. Therefore, public goods are goods that we do not pay for, and a good example of a public good would be our national defense. The third type of good is referred to either as a club good, a scarce good, or even sometimes referred to as a natural monopoly. This type of good is not rival in consumption, and it is not excludable. I apologize. A club good or a natural monopoly and a scarce good is excludable but is not rival. Cable TV is a great example of a natural monopoly or what's considered to be a club good. The last type of good is considered to be a common resource, or in this graph it's referred to as congestible. A common resource is a good that is not excludable, but it is rival. So for example, you could go fishing, so you are not excluding from going fishing, but if I catch a fish, that fish is rival because you are no longer able to catch that particular fish. One graph that you will need to be able to read and understand is a graph that represents a natural monopoly. There are going to be three major things that you need to identify on this particular graph. In this graph, you will need to identify one, what would be the price and quantity of an unregulated monopoly. Two, what would be considered to be the fair price or average total cost pricing. And three, what would be the socially efficient or perfectly competitive firm price and quantity. A company is considered to be a natural monopoly when they are able to demonstrate economies of scale throughout the production process. In the graph, you will notice that as quantity increases, the average total cost curve will constantly fall. Because the relationship between marginal cost and average total cost is where marginal cost will intersect average total cost at its lowest point. Therefore, if average total cost is constantly falling, that would be the reason for your marginal cost curve to lie below the average total cost curve throughout the production process. So if we ask the question, what would be the price and quantity that a monopoly would produce at, you would answer point A. At point A, you have price M and quantity M. Another question would be, if this were a perfectly competitive firm, at what price and quantity would the producer produce at? And at this point, it would be point B. And the reason is because at point B, supply, the marginal cost curve, equals demand. At point B, we would produce at P asterisk and Q asterisk. A natural monopoly is considered to be a regulated monopoly, and because it is a private company, the firm should be allowed to make a profit. So therefore, as a regulated firm, the firm should make the normal rate of return or the fair rate of return, where their economic profit would equal zero. This will occur at point C. At point C, the natural monopoly would produce at price A and QA. The last major economic graph that we want to introduce here is referred to as the Lorenz curve. And the Lorenz curve demonstrates the distribution of income in our society. As you can see in this graph, you will notice the perfect equality line. Essentially, what that represents is that the lowest 20% of income workers would bring in 20% of income. The lowest 40% of income workers would bring in 40% of the income, and so on. The Lorenz curve will demonstrate the actual distribution of income versus the perfect equality distribution of income. So the more bowed out the Lorenz curve, the more unequal the distribution of income would be. You will notice that the Lorenz curve, or the black bowed line, is the distribution of income prior to taxes. One of the reasons that we will tax, and one of the reasons why we have transfer programs, is so that we are able to have a bit more of income equality, where the taxes taken from one individual could provide transfer payments to other individuals. That would be represented by the red bowed line. The Lorenz curve is a graphical distribution of income, but there's also something referred to as the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient also represents the distribution of income. Again, it is a numeric value versus a graph. So when this number is at 0, then that would represent perfect equality. If the number is 1, it would represent perfect inequality. So when we look at a Gini coefficient, we are able to demonstrate what the distribution of income is. The closer the number to 0, the more equal. The closer to the number 1, the more unequal distribution. This section finishes up the actual textbook, and hopefully this presentation helped you out a little bit with some of the major concepts that you will need to know. Once we are done with our exercises with section 14, we will start to move into a review process for the AP exams. You will have in Portals Plus the different assignments that you will need to go through in order to complete all of the material required for class. We will have a final assessment given, and I will be posting that final assessment later this week. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to email me. And once again, on Tuesday and Thursday, I will be available in the Shobi chat.